The satellite feed flickered twice before going black. In the operations center buried beneath Kandahar airfield, 23 pairs of eyes stared at dead screens, while the hum of servers filled the silence. General Marcus Henley's weathered hands gripped the edge of the briefing table until his knuckles went white. The ridge had swallowed another reconnaissance drone, the fourth in 6 days. "Sir, we've lost all telemetry," Lieutenant Colonel Rivera announced, his voice cutting through the tension. Last known position was Grid 77 Alpha, approximately 2 clicks north of the target zone. Henley studied the topographical map spread before him, its contour lines telling a story of jagged peaks and impossible angles. The coast ridge stretched like a granite serpent across the Afghan landscape, its spine punctuated by towers of stone that scraped the belly of low-hanging clouds. Intelligence had confirmed enemy movement along the ridgeline, a high-value target convoy attempting to slip through what they believed was an impenetrable corridor. "Drones won't cut it," Henley muttered, tracing the ridge's profile with his index finger. "Too much interference, too many blind spots. We need eyes on target, and we need them now." The assembled officers exchanged glances. Everyone in the room understood the mathematics of the situation. The ridge rose 11,000 feet above sea level, with passages so narrow that helicopter insertion was suicide. Fixed-wing aircraft couldn't maintain the slow speeds necessary for close reconnaissance without stalling into the mountainside. It was a perfect natural fortress, carved by millennia of wind and ice into an impregnable maze. "What about the warthogs?" Colonel Sarah Martinez suggested from the back of the room. "A-10's can go low and slow." Henley's expression darkened. "Martinez, those peaks reach above 10,000 feet. No pilot's crazy enough to thread that needle, especially not in an aircraft built like a flying tank." But Martinez wasn't finished. Her eyes had found something on the personnel roster, a name that made her lean forward in her chair. "Sir, there's someone who might disagree with that assessment." The room fell silent except for the whisper of air conditioning and the distant rumble of departing C-130s. Henley followed Martinez's gaze to the pilot assignment board, where call signs were listed in neat columns beside aircraft tail numbers. His eyes stopped at a particular entry. "Threading needle, A-10C Captain Valkyrie Thorne." "Thorne," Henley's voice carried a note of recognition mixed with something that might have been concern. "That's the pilot who—" "The one who put an A-10 through Devil's Canyon in Iraq." "Yes, sir," Martinez confirmed. 30-foot wingspan through a 28-foot gap. The story hung in the air between them like smoke from a spent shell casing. Captain Valkyrie Thorne had earned her call sign, Needle, not through careful precision, but through an almost supernatural ability to find impossible paths through terrain that should have killed her. 3 tours, 2 distinguished flying crosses, and a reputation that made seasoned pilots shake their heads in equal parts admiration and disbelief. But Henley remembered the other stories too, the ones whispered in pilot lounges about the woman who flew like she had nothing left to lose. Outside, the Afghan sun climbed toward its merciless zenith while somewhere in the Hindu Kush, an enemy convoy moved like ghosts through passages carved from stone and shadow. The ridge had never been conquered from the air, but then again, the ridge had never met threading needle. 20 minutes later, the ready room fell silent as boots echoed down the corridor. Captain Valkyrie, Needle Thorne pushed through the briefing room door with the kind of quiet confidence that made conversations die mid-sentence. She wasn't tall, 5'6" in flight boots, but she carried herself with the economical grace of someone who had learned to pack maximum impact into minimum space. Her flight suit was standard issue olive drab, meticulously maintained, but showing the subtle wear patterns that marked a pilot who spent more time in the cockpit than behind a desk. "You wanted to see me, General." Her voice held the slight rasp that came from breathing recycled air at 30,000 feet, tinged with an accent that suggested somewhere in the American Midwest, Iowa, maybe Kansas. Henley gestured toward the topographical display. "We've got a problem, Captain. High-value convoy using the coast ridge as cover. Drones can't penetrate the interference, helicopters can't reach the altitude, and fast movers can't slow down enough for effective reconnaissance." Needle approached the map with measured steps, her dark eyes scanning the elevation markers and grid references. She traced potential flight paths with her finger, calculating angles and clearances with the unconscious precision of someone who thought in 3 dimensions. The other officers watched her work, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism. "Narrowest passages here," she said, tapping a section where 2 granite spires created a bottleneck barely wide enough for a mountain goat. 26 feet between the walls if your survey data is accurate." 26 feet, Colonel Patterson scoffed from across the room. "Captain, your aircraft has a wingspan of 57 feet. Basic mathematics says this is impossible." Needle turned to face Patterson with the kind of level stare that had made Taliban fighters duck for cover across 3 provinces. "Colonel, with respect, your mathematics don't account for vertical flight attitudes or the aerodynamic properties of the A-10's wing design." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Patterson's face flushed red above his perfectly pressed collar. "Captain, are you suggesting you can fly a 10-ton aircraft through a passage narrower than its wingspan?" "I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm stating that the GAU-8 Avenger cannon needs line of sight to the target, and sometimes that requires unconventional approaches." She paused, her attention returning to the map. "Question is, what's the time frame?" General Henley stepped forward before Patterson could respond. "Intel suggests the convoy will attempt passage at dawn. That gives us approximately 18 hours to locate and identify the target." Needle nodded once, a sharp, efficient motion that seemed to settle something in her mind. "I'll need full ordnance load, mixed armor-piercing and high-explosive. And, sir," she looked directly at Henley, "I'll need permission to deviate from standard flight protocols." The general's eyes met hers across the map table. In them, she saw the weight of command, the pressure of impossible decisions made in rooms filled with uncertain men. But she also saw something else, a flicker of the faith that had sustained her through 3 deployments and countless missions that existed only in classified after-action reports. "Permission granted, Captain. Bring them home." As the briefing dispersed, officers filing out to prepare for the mission, Needle remained at the map table. She studied the ridge's contours with the intensity of a chess master analyzing an opponent's position, her mind already flying the approach, feeling the stick pressure and throttle responses that would be required to thread stone needles at 200 knots. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around Bagram Airfield like a wool blanket soaked in jet fuel and determination. Needle completed her walk-around inspection by flashlight, her hands moving over control surfaces and weapons pylons, with the practiced touch of a pianist checking her instrument before a concert. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Warthog, to those who flew her, and Tank Killer to those who feared her, squatted on the tarmac like a predator carved from titanium and purpose. Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, her crew chief, emerged from beneath the aircraft wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. "She's ready, Captain. All systems green, full load of 30mm, and I personally inspected every bolt on those Maverick missiles." "Thanks, Santos. How's the GIU-8? "Purring like a very large, very angry cat, ma'am. 1,700 rounds of depleted uranium waiting for someone to make your day interesting." Needle allowed herself a small smile. Santos had been her crew chief for 2 tours, a former Marine infantryman who understood that sometimes the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic was measured in thousandths of an inch and split-second timing. He treated her aircraft like a shrine and her missions like crusades. "Captain Thorne." The voice belonged to Colonel Patterson, who approached through the pre-dawn gloom with the determined stride of a man carrying uncomfortable news. "I've been reviewing your flight plan." "Yes, sir." Your proposed route takes you through terrain that's never been successfully navigated by fixed-wing aircraft. The risk assessment. Colonel, Needle interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from having made life-and-death decisions while pulling 6GS with surface-to-air missiles painting her tail. The risk assessment doesn't account for target acquisition requirements or the tactical situation on the ground. Patterson's jaw tightened. Captain, I'm not questioning your courage. I'm questioning your judgment. Flying an A-10 through those mountains isn't heroism. It's suicide with extra steps. For a moment, they faced each other in the amber glow of the flight line lights, two philosophies of warfare embodied in olive drab and oak leaves. Patterson represented the careful orthodoxy of modern military thinking: risk mitigation, force protection, acceptable losses measured in spreadsheet cells. Needle represented something older and more primal: the warrior's conviction that some missions demanded everything, and that sometimes everything was exactly what you had to give. Sir, that convoy is carrying enough explosives to level half of Kabul. Intel suggests they're planning something that will make the embassy bombing look like a training exercise. If they make it through those mountains, we'll be counting casualties in the thousands instead of the dozens. Patterson's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. There has to be another way. What about coordinated strikes from multiple aircraft, or special operations insertion? No time for SOF insertion, and you'd need a dozen aircraft to cover all the possible routes through that ridge. By the time we coordinate that kind of operation, there'll be ghost stories and wedding videos. She turned toward her aircraft, then paused. Colonel, I've been threading needles since I was 8 years old, helping my grandmother with quilts in her sewing room in Abilene. The only difference now is that the thread is made of titanium and the needles are carved from stone. The sky above the Afghan mountains was the color of old pewter when Needle's A-10 lifted off from Bagram's main runway. The twin General Electric turbofans spooled up to their distinctive whine, pushing the angular aircraft into the pre-dawn darkness with the relentless determination of a locomotive climbing a hill. In the cockpit, surrounded by switches, screens, and the comforting weight of her ejection seat harness, Needle felt the familiar transformation that came with altitude. The ground-bound world of politics and protocols fell away, leaving only the pure mathematics of flight and the mission ahead. Bagram Tower, Needle 17 is airborne, proceeding to assigned patrol area. Copy Needle 17. Weather report shows clear skies, winds from the west at 15 knots. Be advised, search and rescue assets are on standby. The SAR comment hung in the radio transmission like an unspoken prayer. Everyone knew why those assets were positioned, not because they expected a successful rescue, but because recovering what remained of pilot and aircraft from 10,000 feet of granite required specialized equipment and considerable optimism. Needle banked northeast toward the Hindu Kush, the aircraft's navigation system painting waypoints across her head-up display like breadcrumbs leading into a fairy tale written by the god of war. Below, the Afghan landscape unfolded in shades of brown and gray, punctuated by the occasional green thread of a river valley or the orange spark of a shepherd's fire. But ahead, silhouetted against the lightning sky, the coast ridge rose like the spine of some prehistoric beast, its peaks shrouded in morning mist and the kind of weather that turned aluminum into confetti. Overlord Needle 17 approaching initial point, beginning reconnaissance run. Copy Needle 17. Be advised, we're tracking multiple surface contacts in your area of operations. Recommend extreme caution. Caution was a luxury for pilots with options. Needle adjusted her throttles and began the approach that would either end with target acquisition and mission success, or with her name added to the memorial wall in the squadron-ready room. The ridge loomed larger with each passing minute, its granite faces catching the first rays of sunlight and throwing them back like signals from another world. At 8,000 feet, she could see the individual crevices and ledges that would guide her through the mountains. At 9,000 feet, the morning thermals began to buffet her aircraft, reminders that the atmosphere here followed rules written by altitude and stone rather than aerodynamic theory. At 10,000 feet, she was level with the lowest passes, and the ridge transformed from a distant obstacle into an immediate and personal challenge. Overlord, Needle 17 beginning low-level reconnaissance, going silent until target acquisition or emergency. The radio clicked twice in acknowledgement, then fell silent except for the occasional crackle of distant transmissions. Needle was alone now with her aircraft, her mission, and the mountains that had been killing pilots since humans first dreamed of flight. She dropped the A-10's nose and dove toward the ridge, trading altitude for speed and prayers for physics, while somewhere in the labyrinth below, an enemy convoy moved through passages that had never known the shadow of American wings. The first pass through the ridge revealed why 4 drones had died trying to map these mountains. What appeared on satellite imagery as a simple canyon system was actually a 3-dimensional maze of interconnected passages, false summits, and optical illusions carved from living rock. Needle flew at 200 feet above the deck, her wingtips clearing granite walls by margins measured in heartbeats rather than feet, while her targeting pod swept the shadows below for signs of vehicular movement. The A-10 responded to the turbulent mountain air like a heavyweight boxer absorbing punishment, solid, steady, refusing to be moved from its chosen path, despite the atmosphere's best efforts to dash it against stone. The aircraft's legendary stability, designed for low-altitude tank-busting runs across European battlefields, proved equally suited to threading the geological needles of the Hindu Kush. But even the Warthog's forgiving flight characteristics couldn't overcome the basic mathematics of wingspan versus clearance when the mountains decided to close their fists. "Contact," Needle whispered into her oxygen mask, her eyes locked on the thermal display that showed heat signatures moving in convoy formation through a passage 6 miles to the east. 4 vehicles, heavy trucks by the signature, moving north through grid 77 Charlie. She banked hard left, pulling enough GS to compress her vision into a tunnel while her aircraft carved a path between 2 granite spires that rose like cathedral towers into the morning sky. The targeting system chirped as it locked onto the lead vehicle, painting it with invisible laser energy while calculating range, elevation, and the 100 other variables that separated successful interdiction from expensive fireworks. But as she lined up for the attack run, the passage ahead narrowed to less than 30 feet, too narrow for a conventional approach, but wide enough for something that had never been attempted in the long history of close air support. Needle rolled the A-10 90 degrees to port, flying knife-edge through the gap with her wings vertical and her canopy pointing toward one stone wall while her landing gear faced the other. For 3 seconds that lasted forever, she flew sideways through a corridor of granite while her targeting system maintained lock on enemies who had no idea that death was approaching from an impossible angle. "Fox 2, she called as the first Maverick missile separated from its pylon, followed immediately by Fox 2 again, as the second missile joined its partner in the short flight between hunter and prey. The missiles disappeared into the maze of stone and shadow while Needle rolled wings level and pulled up into a climbing turn that would take her above the peaks and into the relative safety of open sky. The explosions came as twin thunderclaps that echoed between the mountain faces like the footsteps of gods. Secondary explosions followed, the deep, earth-shaking detonations that meant high explosives cooking off in chain reactions that turned vehicles into scrap metal and enemy plans into smoke. From her perch at 12,000 feet, Needle watched pillars of black smoke rise from the passage like funeral pyres, marking the end of a convoy that would never reach its intended target. Overlord Needle 17, 4 vehicles destroyed, grid 77 Charlie. Secondary explosions confirm high explosive cargo, returning to base. Outstanding work Needle 17, SAR assets standing down. But the mission wouldn't be over until her wheels touched down at Bagram, and the crew chiefs counted bullet holes and measured stress fractures in aluminum that had been pushed beyond its design limits. Needle turned southwest toward home, her aircraft lighter now by 2 missiles, but heavier with the weight of what she had accomplished in those few seconds of sideways flight through stone. The return flight to Bagram passed in the kind of peaceful monotony that followed successful combat missions. Systems checks, fuel calculations, and the gradual decompression from combat alertness to something approaching normal human consciousness. Needle's hands moved across her instrument panel with automatic precision, while her mind processed the mission in the methodical way that kept pilots sane, in a profession where split-second decisions could mean the difference between distinguished flying crosses and memorial services. Below, the Afghan landscape scrolled past her wing like scenes from a recurring dream. The same valleys, the same villages, the same patchwork of green cultivation surrounded by endless brown. But something had changed in the 27 minutes since she had lifted off from Bagram. The ridge had been conquered, not through overwhelming force or technological superiority, but through the kind of piloting that belonged more to barnstorming exhibitions than modern warfare. Bagram Tower, Needle 17 requesting clearance to land. Copy Needle 17. You're cleared for straighten approach runway 03. Be advised, there's a reception committee waiting for you. Needle's eyebrows raised slightly at the phrase reception committee. In her experience, such committees usually meant either medals or court-martials, and sometimes it was difficult to predict which. She configured the A-10 for landing, extending flaps and landing gear, while the familiar weight of Earth's gravity reclaimed her aircraft from the realm of flight. The touchdown was smooth as silk, main gear kissing asphalt, with the gentle authority of an aircraft that had been designed by engineers who understood that pilots occasionally needed to land on roads, highways, and any other flat surface that presented itself. As she rolled out and turned toward the dearming area, Needle could see the reception committee that Tower had mentioned, a cluster of vehicles and personnel gathered near the squadron operations building. General Henley stood at the center of the group, his hands clasped behind his back and his expression unreadable in the morning sunlight. Colonel Martinez flanked him on the left while Colonel Patterson held down the right side, creating a triangle of command authority that suggested this debriefing would be somewhat more formal than the usual post-mission coffee and paperwork session. But it was the fourth figure that caught Needle's attention, a woman in Air Force blues with enough ribbons on her chest to suggest someone who had spent considerable time in places where ribbons were earned rather than awarded. The silver eagles on her shoulders marked her as a full colonel, but her bearing suggested someone accustomed to wearing stars rather than birds. Staff Sergeant Santos was already positioning the crew ladder as Needle completed her post-flight checklist and began the ritual of shutting down systems that had kept her alive for the past hour and a half. The twin turbofans wound down with their characteristic whine, releasing the morning air from the artificial thunder that had announced the A-10's return to Earth. "How'd she handle, Captain?" Santos asked as Needle descended from the cockpit, her legs slightly unsteady after 90 minutes of high-G maneuvering. "Like a scalpel made of titanium, Sergeant. Not a single system hiccup, and she brought me through spaces that shouldn't exist in the same universe as 57-foot wingspans." Santos grinned with the pride of a craftsman whose work had passed the ultimate test. "Yes, ma'am. I'll have her ready for the next impossible mission by tomorrow morning." As they walked toward the waiting group of officers, Needle found herself wondering what came next. The mission had been successful, 4 enemy vehicles destroyed, high-value target eliminated, and an A-10 returned intact from a flight path that existed more in theory than practice. But she had learned long ago that success in military aviation was often measured by standards that had little to do with mission accomplishment and everything to do with politics, procedures, and the comfort levels of people who made decisions from behind desks. General Henley stepped forward as she approached, his weathered face breaking into the kind of smile that suggested pleasant surprises rather than unpleasant consequences. "Captain Thorne, I believe you know everyone here except Colonel Williams." The woman in blues extended her hand with a grip that suggested she had earned her position through something more substantial than office politics. "Colonel Sarah Williams, Pentagon. I flew F-16s for 15 years before they decided I was better at pushing paper than pulling GS." Needle accepted the handshake while calculating the implications of Pentagon involvement in what should have been a routine tactical mission. "Ma'am." "Captain, I was monitoring your mission from the Tactical Operations Center," General Henley continued. "That was some of the finest flying I've witnessed in 30 years of military service. Flying an A-10 through a 30-foot gap requires either exceptional skill or exceptional foolishness, and the successful target engagement suggests the former." "Thank you, sir. The aircraft performed flawlessly and the intelligence was accurate." Colonel Patterson cleared his throat with the sound of a man preparing to voice uncomfortable truths. "Captain, while the mission was successful, the risks you took were unprecedented. Flying sideways through a mountain pass isn't covered in any tactical manual." "No, sir, it isn't. But neither is allowing enemy explosives to reach their intended target when interdiction is possible." Colonel Williams spoke for the first time since introductions, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in rooms where policy was made and careers were decided. "Captain Thorne, your reputation precedes you. 3 tours, multiple air medals, and a talent for finding solutions that exist outside conventional thinking. That's exactly why I'm here." The morning sun climbed higher above the Afghan mountains, while 5 officers stood in a circle on a piece of concrete that had seen more history than most battlefields. Around them, the normal business of war continued: aircraft launching and recovering, maintenance crews servicing weapon systems, and intelligence analysts processing the endless stream of data that fed the machine of modern conflict. But for this moment, in this place, the focus was on a single pilot who had just proven that impossible was often simply another word for untested. Colonel Williams opened a folder that had been tucked under her arm, revealing documents marked with classifications that suggested involvement from agencies that didn't advertise their existence. "Captain, how would you feel about a change of scenery? Something that would put your unique talents to use in situations where conventional approaches have proven insufficient." Needle's eyes moved from Williams to Henley, reading the subtle communications that passed between senior officers when discussing matters that existed in the spaces between official policy and operational necessity. "What kind of change of scenery, Colonel?" "The kind that involves aircraft and missions that don't officially exist, in places that aren't on any published maps, against targets that pose threats to national security in ways that conventional forces can't address." Williams paused, letting the implications settle like dust after an explosion. "The kind of work that requires pilots who can thread needles that shouldn't exist." General Henley stepped closer, his voice dropping to the conversational tone reserved for discussions of classified operations and career-defining decisions. "Captain, you be working with a joint task force that handles situations requiring creative solutions. The pay is better, the missions are more interesting, and you'd have access to aircraft that make your A-10 look like a crop duster." "And the catch, sir?" Colonel Martinez smiled with the expression of someone who had asked the same question years earlier. "The catch is that successful completion of these missions requires the kind of flying that most pilots consider impossible. The kind of flying you just demonstrated over the coast ridge." For a moment, Needle stood silent in the Afghan sunlight, considering options that would reshape her career and possibly her life. The normal path forward was clear: complete her tour, return to the States, accept promotion to major, and spend the next decade training younger pilots to fly missions that were challenging but ultimately predictable. The alternative path led into shadows where official records became sparse, and missions were measured by their strategic impact rather than their adherence to established doctrine. Colonel Williams, when would this transfer take effect? Immediately, if you accept. Your personal effects would be shipped to your new duty station, and you'd be on a transport to Nellis Air Force Base within 48 hours. Needle looked up at the sky where contrails marked the passage of aircraft carrying supplies, personnel, and the endless logistics of military operations in a country that had been testing military theories for longer than most nations had existed. Then she looked back at the officers who represented two different futures, one predictable and safe, the other unknown and undoubtedly dangerous. Colonel, I've spent 3 tours threading needles that everyone said couldn't be threaded. I suppose it's time to see what happens when someone hands me needles made of something other than stone and steel. Colonel Williams closed the folder with the satisfied expression of a recruiter who had just landed a prize acquisition. Welcome to the program, Captain. Your new call sign will be Phantom, for obvious reasons. As the group dispersed and normal operations resumed around the flight line, Staff Sergeant Santos approached with a question written across his weathered features. Captain, am I losing my pilot to one of those assignments that doesn't officially exist? Looks that way, Sergeant, but I have a feeling this is just the beginning of a very interesting story. 6 months later, in a briefing room that didn't appear on any official base map, Captain Valkyrie, Phantom, Thorne sat across from her new squadron commander, while classified photographs of Impassable aircraft filled the screen behind them. The Coast Ridge had been just the beginning, a qualification test for missions that would take her through electronic warfare corridors that existed only in the imagination of enemy radar operators, and across terrain that had never been successfully mapped by satellites. But that morning in Afghanistan, standing on concrete still warm from her A-10's engines, she was still threading needle, the pilot who had proven that sometimes the only way forward was through spaces that shouldn't exist, at speeds that shouldn't be survivable, with margins of error measured in fractions of heartbeats. The ridge had been conquered, but the sky remained full of needles waiting to be threaded. Years later, when military historians analyzed the engagement at Coast Ridge, they would focus on the tactical innovation of sideways flight through narrow passages, the precision of the missile engagement, and the strategic impact of preventing a high-explosive convoy from reaching its target. But they would miss the human element that made the mission possible, the moment when a pilot looked at impossible terrain and saw not barriers, but pathways. In the squadron-ready room at Bagram, a photograph appeared on the wall of fame, an A-10 Thunderbolt II flying knife-edge between 2 granite spires, its wings vertical and its pilot threading a needle made of stone and sky. Below the photograph, a simple caption read, "Threading Needle Coast Ridge Mission Accomplished." The general had said the ridge was impassable, but generals, Needle reflected as her new assignment took her toward horizons that existed beyond the reach of conventional wisdom, sometimes underestimated what was possible when impossibility was just another challenge to be solved with altitude, attitude, and the kind of precision that turned obstacles into opportunities. The sky, after all, was full of needles, and she had only just begun to thread them. In the years that followed, threading needle became phantom, and phantom became legend. But it all started with a ridge that couldn't be crossed, a convoy that had to be stopped, and a pilot who understood that sometimes the only way through was sideways, wings vertical, canopy pointing toward stone, and faith measured in milliseconds between survival and catastrophe. The mountains remembered, the sky remembered, and in ready rooms across the Air Force, young pilots learned that impossible was often just another word for untested, especially when you had wings made of titanium and a heart that beat in rhythm with turbofan engines climbing toward heaven at full throttle. The general had been wrong about the ridge. But then again, generals weren't pilots, and pilots understood things that could only be learned at altitude, in the spaces between earth and sky where physics became poetry and precision became prayer. Threading Needle had found her calling in those spaces, and the calling had made her phantom. But the story began with stone, sky, and the simple truth that some passages could only be navigated by those willing to fly sideways through the eye of a needle made of granite and impossibility. The ridge was no longer impassable, and the legend of Threading Needle had only just begun.